Good day, everyone. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day and welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by American Jewish Committee. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. In August, experts at the Washington Institute unveiled the Iranian External Operations Interactive Map and Timeline, a groundbreaking tool that tracks Iran's external activities since 1979. This searchable database provides crucial insights into Iran's global operations, including historical and recent plots and ongoing surveillance and kidnapping operations. Joining us today to discuss this map and timeline is Dr. Matthew Levitt, Fromer-Wexler Senior Fellow and Director of the Washington Institute's Reinhard program on counterterrorism and intelligence, and the creator of this innovative tool. Dr. Levitt will be in conversation with AJC's Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer, Jason Isaacson. After we hear from Jason and Dr. Levitt, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, that's questions plural, or use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Jason, the floor is yours.
Daniel, thank you. And Matt, it's good to be with you again. If you attended the AJC Global Forum 3 months ago in Washington, and you signed up for the right session, you would have seen today's esteemed speaker, Matt Levitt, in a panel discussion with former Trump administration point man on Iran, Brian Hook, and my AJC colleague, Ambassador Mark Sievers, director of AJC Abu Dhabi, talking about the multifaceted nuclear and conventional threats that the Islamic Republic of Iran poses to regional and global peace. In important ways, I think that today's conversation with Matt is an extension of that session. We'll have an opportunity to hear from Washington's foremost collector and analyst of data on Iran's malign activities around the world, describing the history, the breadth, the brazenness, and the implications of Iran's global exercise of state-sponsored terror. I think it's especially fitting that we're having this conversation the same summer that we marked the 30th anniversary of Iran's most destructive external operation before the atrocities of October 7th, and that's the bombing of the Amia Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires in 1994. Matt, please tell us what we need to know about your latest project, the just released Iranian External Operations Map and Timeline. It's available on the Washington Institute for Near East Policy website. And then we'll have a conversation after you've made your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. And thanks to everyone at AJC for making this possible. I've been partnering with AJC in a variety of issues, mostly related to Iran and Hezbollah for many, many years. There's no better partner, and I appreciate your hosting this today. The only downside, Jason, is that at the conference, I was literally able to sit next to you, poke you a little bit, and now I can only do it virtually. Thanks again for doing this. I'm going to share my screen and show you this tool and give you a little bit of the background about it. So let me just go straight into the share tool. Jason, can you just give me a thumbs up or a vocal that you can actually see what I've got here?
Yes, I can see.
Super. So before I jump into it, I want to tell you a little bit how we got to where we are. Several years ago, I decided to embark on a project to try and translate the findings of my book on Lebanese Hezbollah's activities around the world into something that was more interactive and accessible to a wider, frankly, younger audience. And got some good advice from some colleagues, and we hired a mapping company, and we put together an interactive map of Lebanese Hezbollah's operations around the world. That map still exists at washingtoninstitute.org. We add to it all the time. Having had that experience, I then developed this Iranian external operations map. And it comes down to this, under the Trump administration, when former CIA director, later Secretary of State Pompeo made that shift from the CIA to the State Department, his last action at CIA, or one of the last actions, was having the CIA declassify a small number of examples of Lebanese Hezbollah and then separately Iranian operations in Europe specifically. He wanted to be able to engage with the Europeans with this declassified information to get more European countries to designate Hezbollah as a terrorist organization and Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the Quds Force, as a terrorist organization as well. And he did, and they published this. It's available online, and it made me want to rip my hair out because there were so few entries on it. My takeaway was a European official who's going to look at this very short list is going to say it's not so bad, when in fact, it's pretty bad. And more to the point, in recent years, it's gotten much worse. By it, I mean what I call Iranian external operations. And what we include in that is Iranian plots to assassinate or abduct or intimidate Iranian dissidents abroad, and surveillance to satisfy those types of operations. We include in this Iranian cyber operations only to the extent that those are cyber operations for the purpose of targeting, trying to figure out, say, where Secretary Pompeo is, where Ambassador Bolton is. These are two American senior former officials that we know the Iranians have been gunning for. We do not include in here cyber operations like when Iran penetrated Boston's Children's Hospital or a dam in Pennsylvania, those types of things. So when you enter the map, and again, this is available open access to everybody for free at washingtoninstitute.org. You have this landing page. We have a tutorial. We have a video where I explain what's going on. I'm not going to subject you to that. You just click out of that, and you have the map tool itself. And what this does is it enables you to track Iran's activities around the world. You can literally drag the map around and zoom in on any one particular place. You could check on this entry here in Albany, where, for example, and you can click on it, you'll get a drop-down menu of this one particular incident in Vermont and in New York. You can do this just by navigating the map. You obviously could also do this by typing in a keyword. So, for example, let's see, you could type in Trump and you could pull up a very recent plot where, well, this is not the plot itself, where the Secret Service admits that it's paying $12 million a year to protect former Trump administration officials from ongoing threats from Iran. But what's most interesting, at least for me, as I use it and as I thought about how people might use it, is the ability to sort through these things. So when we were looking at the data, trying to collect this unclassified information, building the data set upon which this map sits, we were interested in a few key things that officials kept coming to us and asking us about, especially after the arrest in September 2018 of an Iranian diplomat based in Vienna, Asadollah Assadi, who was ultimately arrested, tried, convicted in Belgium court for orchestrating a bombing plot outside of Paris. The Iranians did what the Iranians do, which is they kidnapped a Belgian who was in Iran and ultimately traded that person for this diplomat Assadi, who's now back in Iran. But the point is that this particular plot, a bombing plot in Paris where several U.S. officials, current and former U.S. officials, were going to attend, really was a watershed event for U.S. law enforcement and intelligence officials, and led to a really new focus on, well, what is Iran doing? Is it increased, and are they being more active than they were? And the answer on all those counts is yes. So among the things they were looking at was, well, who's being targeted? So you can go up to the right-hand corner here, and you'll get a drop-down menu, and you can search go through these entries for when the target was an American or a dual national, a foreigner, non-Iranian, a government official, an Iranian dissident, an Israeli, or in a disturbing number of cases, let's just click on that, Jews, not Israelis. Germany raids the Islamic Center in Hamburg, where Iranian officials out of this particular place were plotting a variety of attacks, including some targeting Jews. There's a plot that was just reported today of an Iranian plot targeting a prominent Jew in Germany. Here we have plot in Sweden. We have here a recent ruling in the cases that Jeremy was just referring to, the 1992 Israeli embassy and 1994 Amia Jewish Community Center attacks. And what's neat here is that we provide the sources, so you don't need to take my word for it. You can actually click on the sources. You can go through them and review them all yourself. Not only are people interested in who the target was, but authorities are really interested in who the perpetrator was. So sometimes you'll have an actual Iranian operative, someone from the IRGC or some other type of Iranian or Iranian government official like Asadullah Assadi. Other times you'll have a proxy group. That can be a terrorist group like Lebanese Hezbollah. Increasingly, it's criminals. Sometimes those criminals will be individuals, or it can be, for example, an Eastern European organized criminal enterprise that can function here as a proxy group. So the Iranians have been hiring Eastern European organized crime to carry out attacks on their behalf. Sometimes those criminals are then hiring someone to have another level of a cutout. So a couple of months ago, we had an incident in Sweden where 14-year-old boys were given homemade grenades and were told to throw them over the wall at the Israeli embassy. And they were given a small amount of money. These were not Iranian operatives, but they were hired to do this by Eastern European organized crime groups, who in turn were hired by the Iranians to do just that. Sometimes people want to know other types of information. One second, let me move this away. Like what country is affected. And so when I often, together with AJC, meet with European countries and try and get them to do more on Hezbollah, do more on the IRGC, it's extremely effective. Let's just go to Austria, because it's a country in Europe that starts with A, to be able to say to them, hey, just look at the entities, look at the entries that we have for you. Let's make the most recent be the top one. We have someone from Austria who comes and tries to plot something in the UK. We have the Austrian government releasing a report asserting that Iranian espionage is spreading in Austria. We can go on down these various plots. It's really useful to be able to search country by country. And then we have kind of three thematic ways to break things down: finance and logistics. So you can look at the ways they've used fake IDs, the ways they finance these plots. We gather Iranian statements about this to see what we can track about that, their recruiting efforts, smuggling efforts, weapons in particular, travel patterns, and their weapons procurement. We track counterterrorism actions that authorities have done in response, the arrests, the designations, foiled plots, indictments. In a few cases, there are undercover operations that are declassified that we're able to put in here, and a whole lot of statements or reports that governments have issued that touch on Iran's external operations. And then, of course, there are the plots themselves, and there are a variety of different types of plots: assassinations, attacks of different types, bombings, drones, kidnapping, surveillance, etc. So we have right now 388 plots in this map. There are more in the data set, but they need to be cleaned, and we need all the source information to be able to put them in the map. It's going to be closer to 500 in not too long a period of time. As you can see, it's all the way from Australia around the world, and it spans time. The last thing you can do with this map is at the bottom, we have a chronology. And so you can literally say what's been going on from 1981 to 1983 or much more recently, or you can just click on a year. So we start in 1979. And in 1979, you had an assassination in Paris. One of the very next events was a plot here in Bethesda, Maryland, very close to where I am right now. And if we go to the very, very end, 2025, we've already got a whole bunch of things. No, let's put this, oh, we got to reset that. We already have entries that are in there. For some reason, that's not populating. We'll have to figure out why it's happening. We'll try 2024. Okay. You'll see that there's plenty of very recent things. 2025 hasn't happened yet. So the point is that we're able to use this in our conversations with Europeans, with others, to be able to have really robust conversations about what actually is happening. Let me stop sharing and then continue just for one more moment and just explain you a couple of themes that we've pulled from here. And I encourage people to play with this themselves. I had a couple of assumptions going into this project, and some of them proved to be wrong. One was, for example, that we would see an uptick in plots, but mostly in places where there is fairly lax law enforcement and intelligence, fairly lax border security. So a lot more plots, for example, in South America, in Africa, parts of Asia. And we do see those. And some of the bigger plots that thankfully have been foiled have been in Africa, have been in South America, for example. But one of the big shocking things is that when we bar graph out Iranian operations, especially over the past 5, 6, 7 years, the single longest bar in that graph is Europe, followed by the Middle East and the United States. In other words, the Iranians are not deterred from carrying out plots, even in places that have very sophisticated law enforcement and intelligence services, where border security is much more robust, in places where they have greater diplomatic interests. And this was the other thing that was really shocking. I assumed, because I'm a Westerner and I think like a Westerner, that at least at times that were sensitive and in places that were sensitive at that given time, Iranian plots would probably not be seen. So, for example, when Iran was trying to get France and Germany to take their side in negotiations over the Iran deal, or more recently over attempts to resurrect the Iran deal, I thought maybe we would see a pause in Iranian plots in France and Germany, and we did not. Even at the peak of Iran deal #1 or Iran deal attempt to resurrect #2, we saw those types of plots continue. So there was a plot that was just revealed a few weeks ago where the Iranians sent a Pakistani national to the United States, and he was trying to recruit people to carry out assassinations believed to have been of former President Trump, former Secretary Pompeo, Ambassador Bolton, people like that. And that is another trend that has really spiked, not just the use of criminals as proxies, but of dual nationals who are neither Iranian nor Lebanese. So someone from Pakistan, someone from Azerbaijan, other countries, primarily Shia, but who don't necessarily have a militant background. We've had the opportunity now to brief the findings from our data set and from the map itself. The map sits on top of the data set, to US law enforcement and intelligence and to their counterparts in Israel, other Middle Eastern countries, in Europe. And it's really very vindicating to see that this is really useful for them. They have their own sources of information, of course, but what's useful to them is when someone can kind of pull the information together, first of all, in an unclassified way, so you can actually have a public conversation with and about it, but also able to draw out trends. And so one of the things we're trying to do with and for law enforcement and intelligence is kind of pull at the threads from this data and try and have a better of understanding. Is there a way to kind of not necessarily truly predict, but be able to at least look back and say, under the following types of conditions, we see trends where Iran does or doesn't do something, or, and it would be just as telling and useful if we can't find that, and if it is more random, or if it is more target of opportunity. At the end of the day, what is clear, that if the Iranians find someone they want to target, they're going to go to that place, even if it's a relatively denied space for them. The final thing I want to say here before conversation with Jason and then opening up to Q&A is that sometimes people put a variety of different plot lines from the Iranian perspective. One might consider a variety of different policy objectives into this one big basket of targeted operations. And I think that's a mistake, because there are different targets that they're hitting, and they're doing that for different reasons. When the Iranians are trying to target current and former US officials, that is only something that has happened since the assassination of Qasem Soleimani several years ago, January. And so that has one particular set of guideposts. When the Iranians are targeting Israeli officials and diplomats or businessmen, that's a different set of plot lines that has to do with their hatred of Israel, sometimes their desire to retaliate. So, for example, Iran has said that it will retaliate against Israel for Israel's targeted killing of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran while Haniyeh was there for the new Iranian president's inauguration, but they have not yet. And one of the reasons they have not yet is because if they do something publicly, something militarily, they understand that the Israelis will probably respond back. And they have one red line. They do not want a regional war that is going to spill over into their borders, because that could have a destabilizing effect for them. Which means what they're more likely to do are things that, from their perspective, are reasonably deniable. And I think it's very likely that they are right now trying to plot new international plots targeting senior Israelis as part of, not necessarily the totality of, but part of their attempt to avenge Hania's death. We also see, as I said, plots where they're just targeting Jews. These can be prominent leaders of the community. It can also be, in one case, they sent Quds Force operatives to the United States. They were primarily here doing surveillance of Iranian dissident rallies in New York and in LA and in Washington, D.C. But one of them, while crisscrossing the country, made a stop in Chicago. And the only place he went where he did surveillance that the FBI was watching him do was surveillance of the Chabad and Hillel at the University of Chicago. And so we are very concerned about those types of plot lines. Finally, the one thing more than anything else that has truly spiked is Iranian plots targeting Iranian dissidents. People who are calling out Iran for the forced hijab issue, for the death of people who are incarcerated for not wearing hijab, people who are running Persian language international radio or TV programs broadcasting into Iran in the language Iranians understand in Persian, things that the Iranians would much prefer not get coverage. The bottom line is the Iranian regime is quite concerned about the stability of this theocracy. And because of that, the more concerned they are about the survivability of the revolution, the more aggressive they are going to be, from their perspective, in protecting the revolution. And I'll end with this. The Iranian Revolution in 1979 was never intended to end at the borders of Iran. The reason that they didn't push as hard as they had planned to in the first place to export that revolution is because that effort was interrupted by the Iran-Iraq War. But that war also created something called the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and then they created its foreign arm, the Quds Force. There is an army in Iran, the Artesh. Its job is to defend the borders of Iran. There is something parallel, the IRGC, which has its own navy, its own air force, and it has its own special forces to operate abroad, the Quds Force. They are there not to protect the borders of Iran. They are there to protect the revolution, in the case of the IRGC, and to export the revolution in the case of the IRGC's Quds Force. To the extent that the regime is feeling threats to the revolution, they will deploy the IRGC and the Quds Force ever more aggressively in the region, as we've seen over the past 10 and a half months, in a huge way, and certainly long before October 7th, but not just in the region. And one of the things that European countries in particular are just now getting really, really focused on is this, Iran's external operations. And I can tell you from several recent trips to Europe, they are putting together cases, they're putting together indictments, they're considering designating individuals and entities from Iran that are involved in this space. And that's something the Europeans in particular have not been interested in doing for a very long time. So I've already spoken too long. I'm happy well, first I want to engage in conversation with Jason, of course, but then I'm happy to take this in whatever direction your questions want to go.
Matt, thank you so much for that. First of all, it's very good news to hear that the way that your work has been received by European intelligence agencies is really gratifying, but also I would be remiss if I didn't just thank you on behalf of all of us who have been watching these issues closely for decades for the work that you have done, that you have pioneered, and putting all of this together in a way that is so accessible. It makes such an enormous contribution to the advocacy that we'll continue to work on together. So let me just pose a couple of quick questions, and then let's open it up. So in your study, you point out the sharp increase in Iran's external operations over the latest 4-year period, especially its attempted and successful kidnappings, assassinations, other activities around the world, particularly in Europe and as well as in the United States. Was the trigger for that uptick the killing of IRGC Quds Force Commander General Soleimani under the Trump administration? You referenced that earlier, the January 2020 targeting. Or was it the result of a policy shift in Tehran, or a reaction to changes in the US or other policies? What has led to this enormous increase in activity by Iran?
So I think the different target plot lines have different answers. So certainly Iran was not trying to assassinate current and former US officials, certainly not in plots, say, in the United States, until after Soleimani targeted killing. I still think that for all of its risks was a righteous hit. Qasem Soleimani was involved in plotting all kinds of plots targeting US forces, Americans, allies, and that was in response not just to Qasem Soleimani's many, many years of malign activities, but to very current threats. Now, I remember at the time, some Trump administration officials came to me and said, Matt, people are saying it's going to be World War III. It wasn't World War III. You see, nothing happened. I said, well, you're right, it's not World War III, but please don't get on the soapbox and say nothing's happened yet. You don't do something on Tuesday and expect a response by Friday. I said there will be responses, and there's going to be a long tail to this. And so let's not toot our horns quite yet, despite the fact that this was, I believed, a righteous hit and a risk worth taking. It's the other plot lines that are separate. Iran was targeting Israelis and Jews, frankly. The Jewish plots are a smaller number and subset, but for years. And it was already on the uptick before Qasem Soleimani's hit. Targeting dissidents as well. But what's happened is, as Iran has felt more and more at risk, and there is a correlation here. We take out Qasem Soleimani, and that makes Iran look weak. It denies them one of their most capable operatives. They worry that type of an action, that Israel taking out Hamas's Ismail Haniyeh in Iran at the inauguration in an IRGC safe house where he was their guest. Forget, the action itself. What they're most worried about is the kind of symbolism of it. That there's a good number of people in Iran who aren't too happy with the regime. They don't want those people feeling that the regime is weak, that the regime is vulnerable. So there is this correlation. Qasem Soleimani, I think, did in some ways kind of make them feel more inclined to carry out these operations. But the biggest thing is they are just beside themselves when someone is in the United States going on the news saying women should be able to walk around with their hair uncovered, when Iran International or BBC Persian are broadcasting truth into Iran that they'd rather Iranians not hear. And as part of their shadow war with Israel, it doesn't surprise that over the past few years, they've been increasing their activity. The totality, though, is very, very clear. Sharp percentage increases of activity, as you said, most surprisingly, especially in Europe and the United States.
Have you detected any link between stepped up Iranian external operations and the easing or the stiffening of sanctions imposed by Washington or other countries? How has Iran been held to account? Has it been held to account to any degree for its aggressive actions overseas, other than the Iranian so-called diplomats whose crimes have been revealed and who've been prosecuted or expelled in Europe? What price has the Islamic Republic paid for its activities?
Almost none. And I don't mean to be simplistic or pithy about it, but Iran does what it does because it can, and because it's determined that this is something that has just enough reasonable deniability, meaning they know that we know, and they know that we know that they know, but it's enough reasonable deniability that probably we're not going to bomb Iran, or we're not going to take more serious sanction action, or we're not going to break off diplomatic relations. We're not going to deny Iranians and their wives and children the ability to go shopping in Paris or go to American or European universities, etc. Which, by the way, is a visa authority the State Department has, and we should have used a long time ago. So I look, I'm a former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence at Treasury. I think sanctions have a very big place in what we do. Sanctions will never alone get you out of any pickle. They won't by themselves get around to the negotiating table. They won't bankrupt a terrorist group by themselves. Used in tandem with other tools, they can be very successful. What we have done solely is rely on financial sanctions, and limited ones, frankly, and some law enforcement action. And that's not enough. We have to raise the cost to Iran of engaging in these types of activities. So I've had lots of conversations with European officials, for example, just about designating the IRGC and the Quds Force. And one of the things they typically come back with is they're afraid that if they do that, then the Iranians will shut down their diplomatic missions, the European countries' diplomatic missions in Tehran. And I say, call their bluff. Iran needs the relationship with you even more than you want or seem to need the relationship with them. The Iranians are actually extremely sensitive to being seen as pariahs, diplomatic or otherwise. We have lots of tools at our disposal. We don't use them. And so the Iranians are going to keep stealing from the cookie jar until someone says, stop stealing from the cookie jar, because they can. And so there's a lot more here that we need to do. And it's just beginning to happen, because when the Europeans see that there is assassination plots, abduction plots of people who are legal residents in their country, or who are legally visiting their country, or who are dual nationals, who are national citizens of their country, they understand they have a problem.
But let me ask you, Matt, often these conversations focus on what the United States is doing or isn't doing or should be doing. I've been in Europe several times over the last few months, and I see Iran airplanes in European airports. Shouldn't we call on our closest allies to do a whole hell of a lot more than they've done up to this point?
Yes. I've
And shouldn't they
gotten
just do that
tired.
spontaneously on their own? Why do they need to be pushed
Like, I've
by
gotten tired
Washington
of
to
taking
do what is so
selfies of
obviously
myself in
their
front of the
interest?
Iran Air kiosk at European Airlines and thinking it's funny. It's just not funny anymore. They're getting to that point. Look, the European mentality is one of engagement, and you engage with people you like, you engage with people you don't like, and you're able to. And look, there are benefits to being able to have some type of relationship, but it can't be at any cost. There can't be zero conditionality, right? At a bare minimum, if you're going to come to my country, you got to abide by the laws, and that includes do not murder people. So there's beginning to be a change. So I've had opportunity to talk with law enforcement officials in several different European countries, kind of across the Iran and Iran proxy network spectrum, where they are looking at cases involving Iranian operatives, people who are being hired by Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and putting together cases in ways that they haven't done before. I'll give you another example. In the UK, for many years, when they had cases like this, they would arrest people and quickly and quietly deport them. Right. So now they had a case of someone, a Chechen national from Austria, who came to London and was doing surveillance of Iranian journalists for Iran International television station, which is a dissident television station. And instead of arresting him and quickly deporting him, they put him on trial. He's in jail. He's been convicted. Now, the court proceedings don't include the words Iran or IRGC or Quds Force. I wish they did, but fine. As a first step, they've actually held him accountable, and it begins to, it's not enough, but begins to send a message to Iran that we won't tolerate this type of behavior. I completely agree. Whether it's Iranian flights, whether it's Iranian business, Iranian shipping containers, Iranian officials and their families being able to travel around the world, the number of Iranian really, really bad guys whose children, who themselves are not bad guys, but still are studying at major US universities is kind of crazy. The number of these guys whose wives regularly go to European capitals to shop is crazy. And they're doing these things while their dad and husband is plotting murders around the world. Like, that's just not normal.
You earlier on referenced IRGC and Hezbollah designation as terrorist organizations. AJC for many years has been pressing European countries to fully designate Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, not just the so-called military wing of Hezbollah. It's indistinguishable from the political aspects of Hezbollah. And the IRGC designation is something that just is so self-evident, must be done. Why has it not happened? What do you hear in your contacts with the European governments?
Look,
engagement, is that what it's all about?
More so on Iran than it is with Hezbollah. With Hezbollah, they're worried about retaliation. They're worried about legal threshold. They're worried about the fact that the US has fully designated Hezbollah and therefore doesn't meet with Hezbollah directly. So we do actually sometimes ask the Germans or someone else to do it. But I've said to the Germans, and like, there are ways to navigate this. Like, that's not the reason not to do this. So the Germans have now. designated Hezbollah, and they've not only that, they've taken action, and they just recently took another action, deporting the imam of a center that was already shut down for serving as the headquarters for Hezbollah and the IRGC. The Germans are doing real things right now. We need some other countries to begin to follow suit. I think that this plot that was revealed today, cross-border between Germany and France, targeting prominent leaders of European Jewish communities, is hopefully going to move the needle still a little bit more. But we're not where we need to be yet. And Europeans are just beginning to understand that, failing to respond in any meaningful way that puts any actual sense of squeeze or cost on Iran is a guarantee that they're going to try again.
Let me come back to the project that you've just published, the map and the timeline. By the way, I'm in an office in Los Angeles, which has an energy saving feature, and every now and then it turns the lights off because I'm not moving enough. I'll try to wave my arms.
That's right.
Matt, your project has been driven by data collected painstakingly from multiple sources, and you emphasize again and again that this material is openly available and will be updated as more information comes to the fore, and it can be independently evaluated. To the best of your knowledge, you talked about the disappointment when the U.S. first declassified material, and it was so insufficient. Has the official U.S. intelligence community compiled now a similar map and timeline? And if not, why not? Or is it all Matt Levitt who has to do this work?
As a former deputy chief of one of our intelligence agencies, I'm not going to, even if I know the answer to that question, I'm not going to answer it. The intelligence communities, they really do yeoman's work. And they do both very, very tactical things, finding this person at this time to prevent that thing from happening, and strategic stuff, trying to map what's going on. And generally speaking, they don't necessarily on a regular basis have the time and resources to put together a project exactly like this. They might do one that's more of a snapshot. I don't know if they've changed in that regard. I can tell you that we still get feedback that the Hezbollah map that we're continuing to populate, this new Iran map, one of my colleagues, Aaron Zellin, has developed one for ISIS activity around the world, that these get a lot of attention, and it's vindicating for us when you put so much time into something to see that it's useful to people. But frankly, beyond the United States, whether they have a map or not, they definitely have data sets. They definitely have information about all this. I don't think anything in this data set is going to be new to the U.S. intelligence community, except perhaps the analytical pulling at the threads. And, but this is available, and we're pushing it out to partners in South America, right? To partners in Europe, in Eastern Europe, in Asia, and Africa. They don't have this type of thing at all. And it's really, really, really useful to them.
Let me just reiterate what I said earlier on, which is the enormous contribution that you're making to the advocacy that we've been doing against Iranian malign activity. So thank you again. Last question from me, and then let's open it up. From 30,000 feet, what, in your estimation, would it take to put an end to the Iranian regime's global campaign of terror? Maximum pressure sanctions, as we saw after withdrawal from JCPOA under the Trump administration for the last couple of years, a more robust, a more kinetic message to the mullahs? What do you think it's going to take?
So I think it's going to take a variety of different things, and it's not going to change overnight. And that, in part, that's because the types of things we have to do are not going to happen overnight. The first thing is that there's no panacea here. And we had this conversation at the Global Forum, and like I tracked Iran's activities abroad and Iran's funding of its proxies during the maximum pressure campaign, and they actually increased. Now, the proponents of the maximum pressure campaign will say, yeah, but it takes time, and if we had had more time, it would have gotten to a point eventually where it put enough financial pressure on Iran that it would have had I don't think that's very likely, because at the end of the day, you and I hear numbers like Iran providing Hezbollah $800 million a year and think, wow, that's a lot of money. But when you are an economy the size of Iran's, even under sanction, and when you prioritize financing Hezbollah over doing things for your constituents, because you don't see them as constituents, then it's actually not so difficult to come up with that kind of money. And so maximum pressure, even maximum pressure alone is not going to get you there. There is definitely space for more sanctions, for renewing sanctions. This is going to come up on multiple fronts. Iran's malign activities in the region, which have obviously skyrocketed over the past almost 11 months. Iran's nuclear program, which hasn't gotten anywhere near as much attention, but has also progressed significantly over the past almost 11 months. And Iran's international targeting plots of the types we're discussing now. All of these, I think, are combining together with other things like Iran's alliance with Russia, Iran providing drones, and now we are concerned about providing rockets to Russia, that are putting Iran more on the radar of the international community, in particular, the Europeans. So I think we need to do things big and small. I think if we and the Europeans put more serious visa restrictions in place and made it more difficult for Iranians who are themselves or who are first degree relations of persons who are involved in this type of activity, and said, look, you just can't come here, that would begin to put pressure, at least within that household, because people want to shop in Paris and they want to send their kids to Princeton or wherever it is. I think that we need to be much more aggressive on the law enforcement side. And we need to have many more public cases. And in those public cases, call out Iran, call out the IRGC. I am fully aware, as someone who started his career in the FBI, about the fact that's not easy. And you need not just information or intelligence, but you need evidence, things that hit evidentiary threshold. We should not be loosening those requirements, but we can do that. And we should be working together with allies to get allies to do the same. Iran and its proxies are active around the world. Just today, a Hezbollah operative who was arrested in Brazil some time ago was finally convicted for the plots he was engaging in, targeting Israelis and Jews in Brazil. And so, there's all kinds of, from Brazil to Thailand and the US to the UK, there's a lot of countries that are affected by this, and we should be working closely together. The good news is that the US State Department for many years still has a group that gets together once or twice a year to kind of compare notes, law enforcement, intelligence, sanctions, treasury types on Hezbollah activities around the world. And now they have one specific to Iran, the IRGC, and the Quds forts around the world. And that is doing a really great job of bringing countries together. They can hear from one another. Tell me about the case that happened in your country. What were the challenges you had in putting together a legal case in your country? How did you overcome that? It's very tangible, and it also creates networks across borders of people who are working against the same malign actors, Iran and its proxies, and that's really effective.
That's really gratifying. Matt, thank you so much. Let's open it up to questions. Daniel?
Thank you, Jason. Yes, we have a lot of questions from the audience. Our first from Lisa Goldschmidt. You spoke about locations and groups of people that have been targeted. Are there new places or new groups of people you see them going after? And a related question from Andrew Robin. Does any of your tracking focus on Iranian influence in American universities and tracking the organizations that are also on campus and their nefarious acts or plots?
Okay, so second question first. No, because we really methodologically, there's so many things you want to track and so many important things are going on. Methodologically, we kind of bookended this really, really strictly so that we are looking at assassination plots, abduction plots, surveillance plots that are involving intimidation of Iranian expatriates living, outside of Iran, and different types of cyber activity that tie into the surveillance for those plots. So there's all kinds of really interesting things that don't make it into this particular data set. So far as where, please take a look at the map and you'll see just how geographically dispersed these plots are. And one of my takeaways is that Iran is going to go where their targets are. I bet you there are also targets of opportunity. They want to hit the Israelis, and they've got a guy who says, oh, I've seen an Israeli businessman here, or I see an Israeli diplomat who takes the same route to work every day. But my big takeaway is they're not looking necessarily for only low-hanging fruit, and they're looking to hit major Iranian dissident rallies. They're looking to hit senior American, Israeli, by the way, also kind of some of the Gulf country officials, and they will go where the targets are. the breadth, the geographic breadth of these plots was a little bit of a surprise. I do think that over time, they will continue to aggressively operate in places that are difficult. But I also think it's likely that they will, at the same time, you squeeze a balloon, it expands in another direction. And unless you squeeze it hard enough to pop, well, we're not squeezing hard enough to pop. It's going to branch out. And I think we will likely see growth of operations in South America and Africa in particular, because those are places where they can operate a little bit more freely. By the way, it doesn't mean that those will come off. There was a major operation targeting Emirati, American, and Israeli diplomatic personnel in Ethiopia, but it was thwarted, right? We don't know this for sure, but my money, 9 out of 10 here, is that the Mossad picked up on it, because this is something that the Israelis pay more attention to than anybody else. But it doesn't mean that just because they're operating in a place that has greater freedom of movement for them, that they will be successful. And again, one of the things we, the United States, are working really hard at is to build up some of the awareness and then the capabilities of countries from Brazil to Thailand and a whole bunch of others in between to be aware, like, this is what they are actually doing in your country. Here are past examples. And believe me, when countries hear that, they want to know and they want to be able to prevent.
Thank you. Our next question from Judy Berkowitz. How does diplomatic engagement with the Iranian regime affect these attacks, particularly when the EU, for example, doesn't condemn the attacks, doesn't take action, or welcomes their diplomats with open arms? Do they go up, down, have no effect?
So look, it's not like it's a white or black situation. It's not like the Europeans are either doing everything I'd like them to do or they're doing nothing and they're welcoming everybody with open arms. They have kicked some people out. They have issued some very strong demarches. It's nowhere near what I would like to see, but it's not like they're doing nothing. The Europeans in particular are very sensitive to the idea of engagement. That as you make your difficult calculus, they think that the benefit, maybe even just by a little bit, but the benefit is in favor of being able to engage, to have people on the ground in Iran to be able to get a sense of what's happening. You don't want to go blind. I hear that. I get that. I just believe that the Iranians want it and need it even more than we do in the West. And therefore, we can't allow ourselves to say there's a whole host of things that under other circumstances we would do, but gosh, the Iranians might shut down our embassy. That they can't have us over a barrel like that. At the end of the day, though, I don't see the Iranians being affected by almost anything, doing things against them, not doing things against them. Perhaps it's because we're not doing enough. And I think it has much more to do with the fact of, look, when they are feeling this ill at ease about the status of the revolution, which is primarily a domestic issue, they're going to be more and more aggressive to, from their mind, defend the revolution against the West that's doing all these things against them, against Israel that's doing all these things against them, against bad Iranians that are trying to corrode the regime from within. That's all their perspective. You and I might put it in different terms, right? But they're going to be even more aggressive in defending the revolution. The fact of the matter is, even with this current president, there has been a merging of what at one point you might have described as two parallel leadership elements within Iran. One is the revolutionary leadership led by the supreme leader, which controls all the true elements of power, from the law enforcement to the military to the IRGC to the nuclear program and the courts and the media. And then there is the pseudo because it's not really fair and free elections. But look, I really do think that the current president of Iran is much more of a moderate than the supreme leader. That's within a relative spectrum that still puts him well right of center, right? He's no Zionist. He has lots of nice things to say about Hezbollah. And I think these international Iranian plots don't bother him one little bit. It still puts him far left of the supreme leader, but Iran is still Iran. And so at the end of the day, we need to understand that they will do what they think they need to do to defend the revolution. And the last point here is this: like any bureaucracy, including our own, of which I was a part more than once and saw it firsthand, there's all kinds of left hand, right hand. There's all kinds of interagency cooperation and rivalry that's going on. It's very, very clear that Iran's Ministry of Intelligence and Security, their CIA, doesn't necessarily see eye to eye with the IRGC's own intelligence organization, the IRGC-IO. And they cooperate. There's also tension. The supreme leader says, I want something done. I want Qasem Soleimani's assassination avenged. I imagine there's some cooperation and also some jockeying. If the supreme leader wants it done, I want my agency to be the one to have done it. Not just my agency. I want my office within my agency. I want maybe me to be the one to have done it. If you look back at the indictment of a guy named Pour Safi, who was indicted for plotting to assassinate Ambassador Bolton here in Washington, D.C., it reads like a spy thriller. And at one point, you really get a sense of this guy feeling, look, I know there's all these, please do it now, go. He's telling his operative, who he doesn't know is actually an FBI informant, go now, just do it, whatever the risks, do it now. I read between those lines an element of tension that includes interagency rivalry.
Thank you. Our next question from Charlie Hodge. The tool provides some essential hard data and information about Iran's external activities, as you've discussed. Can you speak a little bit more about what you learned compiling this information about perhaps why Iran does what it does and maybe when it does it?
Yeah, this is an excellent question that I was hoping nobody would think to ask. Kudos, because this is the sticky widget, right? I am very, very comfortable telling you like the hard facts that we can pull from this. And there's all kinds. And there's a PowerPoint slide deck that I've developed that I use when I'm briefing this to government agencies. And I have a slide that gets to this. And it comes down to a lot of theories. We don't have hard facts. I think the most important takeaway is what I've said a few times now. The Iranians will go where they see the threat, where they see the target, and they will not be deterred by, whether they have good relations with that country at the moment, whether they're asking diplomatic things of that country, whether that country has good law enforcement. They're going to try and do what they can. There are all kinds of situations where they try and exact revenge from their perspective for something that was already done to them. Now, it might be that something was done to them because they were plotting something against us that we did something to them to prevent, but from their perspective, it's a response. Sometimes it's very hard to parse out how far up the decision-making chain or chains within Iran a particular plot goes. Is this something that the supreme leader has approved? Do we assume that every CIA action is approved by the president of the United States? How far up does it go? Now, in some cases, we have some hints in terms of how the U.S. has reacted or things they've said. But in other cases, it's really not clear. And there seems to be within Iran a track record of not asking permission in advance, but if you have to, asking forgiveness later. And for Iranian leaders rewarding and promoting initiative even when it goes poorly. So, for example, several years ago, IRGC Navy personnel abducted a bunch of British Navy personnel who were in the Shatt al-Arab, where the borders of Kuwait and Iraq come together in this narrow piece of water. That seems not to have been something that was ordered from above. Someone took the initiative. It didn't go so well. It was pretty embarrassing from Iran. And the rumor is that those people were all promoted. So, how much of this is self-initiative? When it comes to something big, like this recent plot that was thwarted with an indictment of this Pakistani nationals purportedly sent by Iran to carry out assassinations of prominent political personalities, there's no way that that's not done with senior Iranian cover and request. But some of the other plots, it's not entirely clear. So there's a whole long conversation where I can try and provide more theories, and I have them, but it's just that. It's just theories. The data so far doesn't give us good leads on why they do this type of plot against that type of target in this type of place at that type of time. And it may just come down at any given point to that's the one that's available, and they get multiple plot lines going on. Here's an opportunity, take it.
Thanks, Matt. We have about 50 more questions, but I think for the sake of time, I'll give you two final questions before turning it back to you, Jason. First is maybe more of I don't know if it's a technical question, but there's a few people that are certainly using this tool while you're speaking, and they're asking about why they don't see anything on there about October 7th. So that's one question. And then the last question from Stan Cass: how can we effectively increase global awareness about Iran's role as the central orchestrator behind groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, so that a broader audience, including communities that might not fully understand this connection, become informed about their influence and activities.
Okay. Look, October 7th was a long methodological debate, but at the end of the day, we did not consider that to be a direct Iranian external operation. It was done by an Iranian proxy. Not every action by an Iranian proxy is in this data set. It was actually harder when it came to Hezbollah because Hezbollah is so close to Iran. There are tons of Hezbollah plots that are in the Iran external operations data set because they clearly either involved an Iranian operative or were very much directed by, instigated by Iran abroad. October 7th was a Hamas plot. It had some significant Hezbollah strategic input to it. The Iranians certainly provided money and weapons as they have over time, but not every Hamas plot, even October 7th, is going to make it into this data set, which is by no means, of course, an effort to say that October 7th was anything but one of the worst acts of terrorism in history by almost any measure, but it wasn't specifically to what this data set is looking for. Specifically Iranian plots abroad. So this is not going to include every act of terrorism, even huge acts of terrorism. Now, what can you do to contribute to the ability to get this message out to others in other communities? I'm not being paid to say the following. I will just tell you from personal experience. You partner with AJC. Not all, but a significant portion of my work on Iran and Hezbollah in particular, especially in Europe, but elsewhere too, has been done in close partnership with AJC. And AJC's activities here in the United States are extremely effective. Mark, the ambassador, who's now in the UAE, is doing a tremendous job getting AJC's presence, felt in the Gulf states. There is a need to get people onto college campuses, not to argue with people, but to present facts. I'll be presenting this map at a university in about a week. We'll see how that goes. But AJC is one of the few organizations that is really getting out there and getting the message out there. And so it's why, when Daniel and Jason and some others and I had conversations about the fact that I was doing this, and they said, well, would you be willing to do a webinar with Advocacy Anywhere? The answer, of course, is, you tell me when. And that's probably the best place to end.
Daniel, let me pick up. Matt, thank you for that. And our partnership with you and frankly with your colleagues at the Washington Institute is so important to the advocacy work that AJC does around the world. I can't sign off without just mentioning the fact that I'm sitting here in Los Angeles, the AJC office, in a room that is dedicated to my late former colleague and friend, Dr. Neil Sandberg, who was our Western Region Director, our Intergroup Relations Director, our founding director of our Asia Pacific Institute, which was then called the Pacific Rim Institute. But it just speaks to the work that AJC has been doing around the world, in this state, in this city, in this country, but in partnership with you, Matt, in Europe and elsewhere in the Middle East as well. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for your ongoing partnership with AJC. Daniel?
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Jason, for today's AJC Advocacy Anywhere program. And thank you to our global audience for tuning in. Again, to access the interactive map, you can go to www.washingtoninstitute.org/Iran External Ops. I think the link is now in the chat. And to stay up to date on the ever-evolving situation in Israel and the region, make sure to follow AJC on social media at AJC Global. You can find more resources and ways to take action at ajc.org/Israel-Hamas War. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Matt, and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you tuning in. Jason, Daniel, thank you.